So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this final session of the 2022 WVU Extension Cider School. We really appreciate your participation over the last 2 months and hope that you have found this information useful or hopefully interesting. So, today's session will be presented by myself, Lisa Jones. I am the program coordinator at the Small Farm Center, and we also have joining us Jesse Richardson, who is a WVU professor of law and also the lead land use attorney. So lots of good questions for Jesse later. Dr. Dolores Signites is unavailable currently, so she has entrusted me with presenting some of her content on agritourism. However, just so you know, I am not the expert on this particular topic, so I will take any questions that you might have, but with the caveat that I'm probably going to just send them to Dee as the content expert to actually address them accurately. I will do my best, but Dee is the expert on agritourism. So we do want to recognize as we move forward that our efforts for the cider school this year have been supported by funding made available through the West Virginia Department of Agriculture, and that is through the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. So if you're interested in applying for marketing funds for an association in the future, or have other questions about how this program can be used, check out this funding source. It typically opens in December and the grant is normally due in January. You could always ask us questions about this particular program as well. Or if you go to the Department of Ag website, you can read about stuff that's been funded previously and some of the expectations whenever it comes to grant writing time. So today in the session, we're going to explore some additional opportunities for sales that we touched on a little bit already. We're going to also address that importance of agritourism and what that can and does look like here in the state. And then I'm going to pass it off to Jesse to shine some light, hopefully, on these legal issues surrounding the cider industry, because just hearing him talk about it makes me feel it's very complicated. But that's just me. And then we're going to wrap up today's session with a discussion and your stories as participants in this realm. So we would love, love, love for your participation. You can either just open your mic and talk, or you can put stuff in the chat box and we'll get to it. And we'll be doing that in a little bit. So as we have done in each session, we want to start the day by kind of reading the room with a poll. So you've probably completed this multiple times now, and I appreciate that. I'm just going to do it one last time. It is multiple choice. So I've gone ahead and launched the poll. So just give me a little bit of feedback about what your particular role is here today. And that way we have an interesting idea of who else is joining us. And yes, if you do not see yourself in this particular poll, go ahead and in the chat box, you can just say, hey, this is who I am. This is who I feel like I represent. So thank you all for participating in the poll. Got a little bit of everybody here today. Just excellent. And I do realize that the poll that popped up is slightly different than the one that's on the screen. I will have to change that for next time. Okay. Cidery and planning. Perfect. Yes, welcome back. Okay, so by now, this is session number 5. Hopefully you can tell that there is a clear market opportunity for new or current producers of apples in West Virginia that are, maybe you're looking for alternative crops, or you want to add a multi-use apple to your orchard instead of just a table or dessert apple. Or maybe you're just looking for a new way to diversify a farm with additional marketing opportunities, or even starting a farm. So cider makers across the country are really, we'll say, desperate for cider apples at this point, and they want to continue to create these unique varieties of cider, which we'll get into a little bit. But we also know that orchards are a big investment, so we recognize that. But we also have talked about, what that looks like in the way of profitability. So the choice to plant that apple tree is a long-term decision. It is that investment. Those young grafted trees that can take years before they're really ready to produce a harvest. And but full production does last multiple decades. So that's always a good thing. And the most recent feasibility data that I was able to find from Virginia um, did show profit by year 4 for growers, and that's assuming they are receiving at least $12 per bushel with 600 bushel per acre yield. So that can change if you're getting less bushels per acre, then you'd want to, of course, supplement that with an increase in price. But that's kind of on the lower end. If you hear about bushels for cider apples, it's typically much more. So I do have a link that in a little bit I will put into the chat box. And that way, if you would like to look at an apple budgeting spreadsheet, you can do so. There's a really good one that's got Excel with fillable boxes and whatnot from Virginia that I would highly recommend. So I'll put that in the chat in just a bit. So we also know that if you are an apple producer and you're doing high density systems, you can see yields up to 32 bins per acre. So one bin is equal to about 20 bushels. And so you have 24 to 32 bins per acre, and that is equivalent to 480 to 640 bushels per acre if you really want all of the math. And then we have costs, right? So your two largest costs associated with apple production are going to be those chemical inputs and the labor. And that harvest cost, if you look at the slide, it can vary widely. And part of that is the types of apples that are chosen. Because a cider apple, sometimes it might be smaller. If we're thinking about crab apples, it takes a lot more to fill up a bin. And then it takes longer to, pick all of those. So, but there's the demand, right? There's a demand for these specialty apples across the country. So finding a market for them should not be challenging. And I highly recommend you get those agreements in place before you start before you start harvesting. That would make sense, right? So Josh Bennett, who's the owner at Hawk Knob, mentioned that they buy 80 tons of apples annually, and that is for the one cidery, and they're still expanding. So that number is probably going to go up pretty significantly because they're adding on new flavors, and that's just to meet his one business and those needs. And he's buying apples 200 miles away in West Virginia because he is not able to find enough apples in his local area. So there's definitely the demand. And if we're thinking about venturing outside of West Virginia, because we say, oh, there's only a couple cideries here in the state. If you're thinking about sales with more of a geographic diversity, because you really, really want to expand, maybe you want to have 1,000 acres of apples, states that are really traditionally considered inhospitable to commercial apple growing are starting to venture into cider making. Even though they're not able to procure those local apples. So my example here is the founder and co-owner of Green Bench Meat and Cider. They are located in St. Petersburg, Florida, not really known for apples, right? So the owner is traveling 8 hours north to purchase apples. So they have to travel multiple states to find apples. We're not even talking about local apples at that point. So this is really great for apple producers that really want to expand that acreage, but it's also good for the cider industry overall because we are starting to introduce cider into areas of the country that aren't typically orchard regions, right? You think of Florida, you're probably going to think of an orange and not an apple. But this also adds additional market for overall industry growth, which is pretty exciting. But of course, we are coming back to that issue, which is the bottleneck. That's the cider apple production to meet the high demand. So we know the demand is there. It's the supply side, which hopefully we can convince some more people to start growing apples and show how profitable it can be. So looking at the hard cider side, there's a benchmark study from Penn State University, and they created the snapshot of what the cider market looks like in the range of volume-based annual production levels. And that includes looking at a broad market, looking at wholesale through retail outlets for different volume categories. And if you want the link, I will send you the link for this whole study. I only took a very small snippet out of it. I'm just looking at the majority here. So the study showed that the majority, which in this case is 41% of the people who participated in that survey, were producing between 1 and 10,000 gallons of cider annually. And then of that group, 40% of those cider producers are just purchasing juice and for doing the fermentation and packaging on site. Only 30% were growing, or 36% were growing their own apples. So again, huge demand for the apples themselves and the juice specifically. So outside of that 76% total, some other methods include for procuring and processing. Some of them were purchasing frozen juice. So there's definitely a market for the juice if you feel like taking that on yourself as a producer, or there's that middleman step that we could also get into. So if we're thinking about how a bushel translates into a gallon, 20 bushels, right? We said 20 bushels are in one bin, and that one bushel is expected to yield between 11 to 15 gallons of cider. So that one bin that you're able to produce is equivalent to 220 to 300 gallons of cider. And so for those entities that we said are the majority, right, between 1,000 and 10,000 gallons of cider, we are talking about anywhere between 4 to 45 bins of cider needed per cidery. So there's a pretty big difference there, but there's also a pretty big difference between 1 and 10,000 gallons of cider. But the point is that that is just the majority. There's also another chunk of people that were surveyed under this benchmark study that are doing over 100,000 gallons of cider annually. So again, the need is definitely there. And then looking at that study, thinking about the different steps, as I mentioned, those 40% that are purchasing juice, they're going to need some kind of processor. So that could be your farm, it could be a separate entity, but this is honestly a segment of the industry in West Virginia that really needs to be developed and built up. So once those apples are picked, they're going to need to go through cleaning and washing, and they need to be milled and pressed, and the pulp needs to be removed, and finally the collection of those juices. And that's because that's what our cider makers need for their creations, right? But not everybody wants to take on every single one of those steps. And honestly, there's a lot of different things that you could potentially do in there when it comes to different businesses. You could do pumice from the pulp. Anyway, that's a separate thing. But the point is that this industry is so open to interpretation of different types of businesses. We could have mobile pressing units. We could have facilities around the state where everybody just takes their apples for juicing or for all of these steps to get the juice. And then, of course, we need transportation. What is our transportation of that juice going to look like? Are they tanker trucks for distribution to facilities? So there's a lot of potential for growth here. And so the production in hard cider in West Virginia, I mean, it's traditional, right? We talk about how it's got roots in our history that go back way before West Virginia was even a state. But modern production is considered young, and that's part of the reason, in addition to things we'll get to, of why there's only a handful, right? And we know that the cideries are engaging in direct-to-consumer sales. That includes these online sales and cider clubs, and many of these outlets were even critical steps for businesses to survive the initial waves of COVID when COVID was at its peak, right? So we really can't ignore the ways to market. We don't want to do that. We want to capture additional dollars whenever we can, right? So we don't want to ignore tourism as an opportunity that also is supporting the development of the cider business itself, but we also should think about how that translates to local and regional community development. So we're going to talk about food and drink tourism and what that looks like and how agritourism fits in that. So it is this kind of perfect inflection point between two favorite American pastimes, right? Which is eating and drinking and also traveling. So the travel industry has been a kind of a crazy moving target, especially I mean, one, because it's becoming modern and it's this continuous evolution, but we've also seen a change with COVID. So with consumer attitudes that shift, we've seen visitors wanting these authentic experiences for this experiential travel where they want to travel in a responsible way, but they're also wanting to live like a local. They want to be somebody that just comes to your town and takes in the whole experience. And so the pandemic has fueled the surge in opportunities. It's maybe you've seen it locally. I know personally I have friends that are doing this right now. So that could be maybe an outdoor space or a location where people can be distanced, that kind of thing, or an atmosphere that even gives like a healthy vibe. It can be deemed safer, which is really interesting to think about. So this food and drink tourism really at the core is this evolving and growing phenomenon in experiential travel, which is defined here as this traveling for the taste of place in order to get a sense of the place. So this translates into, if you've ever heard of agri-culinary tourism, food and drink tourism, gastronomy is a word that's used a lot. Think about culinary tourists. Sometimes we might call them foodies, and they are sharing millions of photos of food and beverages on the daily across all these different social platforms. You see them on Instagram, you see them on Facebook, you might be friends with folks on Twitter and Snapchat and Flickr and all of these different platforms. And this increases the awareness of other consumers to different cuisines. Like we see that with Appalachian cuisine. Everybody got really hyped around ramps at one point, and different cultures. And it fuels the desire to also have that experience. So it just builds upon the people that are already doing that. And it says, oh, I went and did this. Maybe my friends will go do this next because they have the same personalities, right? So these agri-culinary travel-based TV shows, they put them on the Food Network all the time and even on public broadcast. And then you see them in magazines and blogs. All of this generates this interesting segment of travelers that are really traveling based on cuisine, which is something kind of unique. And but we don't want to, I mean, this is not a bad thing. This is a great thing. So this food and drink tourism has tons of advantages, especially for local communities. Places like West Virginia should really think about when it comes to planning, but it allows us to grow our local pride for what's really unique when it comes to our specific region and what those traditions look like. So we're able to give a sense of place to the tourists through our local culture, our heritage, that culinary heritage. Maybe in your section of the state, everybody makes green beans a certain way, or everybody makes pinto beans a certain way, or everybody has cornbread a certain way. There's all of these things associated with culinary heritage, which is just incredible that folks are looking for. So we are attracting curious people that are typically respectful visitors that are interested in sustainable experiences. A lot of times they're educated. So they want authenticity when it comes to travel. And they're also typically, they have an income to support those interests. So that can harness local impacts. It can grow tourism, food and beverage tourism, and it can grow your economic impact of your area about 25%. So if we think about on that across the state, tourism in West Virginia, it creates over a $4 billion with a B dollar direct spend. It creates $520 million in state and local taxes. It creates 45,000 tourism supported jobs with a $450 average spend per visitor, and 80% or 87% of those annual visitors are return visitors, return customers. So you get that basically almost like a return on your investment. They keep coming back, especially if you give a good experience. So this is another way to think about marketing opportunities. And this is directly tied or closely tied with agritourism in West Virginia, because we know that all of our food and our drink is going to originate on the farms in the state. So the demand for these experiences is a driver of agritourism. And we see that in the United States. We also see that globally. If you have ever heard of terroir, which is used, and it's really like a French concept for taste of place. They use it in wine all the time. It is a driving force. And really it helps emphasize regions, and we are able to capitalize on those visitors that want those experiences, and they want to do it at the closest to the original source. So they want to come to your farm and experience and have these experiences. So think unique locations, different methods of production. They're looking for landscape aesthetics. If you look at this picture on the right with the Swill Dog hard cider, in the background, you see the mountains, you see the trees, they're taking in the landscape. We're also looking at what's that cultural geography among different other concepts and experiences. So lots to think about, lots to take in. And then how do we attract these customers? Are we becoming those magnets? Are we what people are seeking out? So the New River Gorge Bridge here is a pretty, it's pretty famous, right? It's a pretty famous site. So that's one way to attract people to the state, saying, oh, we've got these outdoor things, but we also need to take in other aspects that we can provide. So we need to look at what's the supply side of tourism. We've got nature established, right? There's all these wonderful outdoor recreational offerings, but we also need to look at what's the product that people are able to experience while they're here, and what can they take with them, hopefully, to give to others. So our West Virginia Tourism Office is doing a great job developing these markets, but it's only as successful as what products we are able to offer. So that's where all of you come in to help tourism and say, this is how we can contribute to these grand marketing efforts here in the state. So we want to understand that we're in this to partner together. We're trying to increase these product offerings by offering farm visits and different types of cider, and all of that should be complementing, what's a wild and wonderful offering from West Virginia. We need to be able to showcase the state and say, this is what is the best thing about the state, and really make it a unique destination to keep people here longer, and then they'll spend more money, hopefully, right? That's the goal. So this appeal for this quest for the taste of place, with offering these unique foods and drinks that can complement other things in the state. Those are some of the big goals. And what does that look like in the state? So there's a ton of different things that we could think about, but some of those could be some of the food tours. We could offer art of the cocktail if you have a cidery or a spirits place, doing classes or competitions that we've seen, pairings. There's lots of great on-farm events that have popped up. You could offer a concert if you have a large enough space, or maybe even a sporting event if you if you're really getting into it. There's places that offer conferences that I know we're able to sometimes take advantage of. You could offer specialty classes like cooking like a local. So there's lots of opportunities out there. So I don't want to put you in a box. I want you to think like, think outside the box, right? But I want to make sure that I highlight that some of those opportunities could include growing the high quality craft beverages and the cideries that we're offering and give a unique marketing or a PR angle to them. There could be educational programming to really foster those business linkages. You could team up and do joint events. So there is a restaurant week in Charleston. So you normally might think, oh, restaurants are competing businesses. But in this example, everybody teams up and they try and highlight all of the businesses and support everybody at the same time. Um, so there's also ways to establish and support the expansion of additional cideries, which hopefully we're trying to do here. And then, of course, recent law changes that are positive. So, like the brunch bill, which gives people different opportunities to cluster businesses together, attract those visitors, and then really leverage what could be a beverage trail and like an alliance around that, just because of a really positive change in the law and our legal structure. Um, so a good example of what this has looked like elsewhere has been if you think about Napa Valley. So Napa Valley evolved from like the spa experience to wine experiences. And in 1981, there was this designation for Napa Valley in California as the first American viticulture area. So that focuses really on the brand for Napa Valley. And if you think about that area, you typically think wine, unless you have family there. Like the automatic thing that pops up is wine. So how do you create that in West Virginia? How do you build your business into what the brand should be for the state? And we recognize that there are definitely challenges that would need to be addressed. And these are things that have to be done really more on like a larger planning piece. So getting your local politicians involved would be a great way, and talk to your Department of Health and whatnot. But so we understand that there is traffic. There can be traffic on the highways. We've got narrow roads in certain locations. Sometimes roads are hard to pass through depending on where you live. All of that, we understand. Roads are always an issue. But there's also health and environmental concerns sometimes. Our community sometimes might have a conflict. Their lifestyle quality might not always mix with plans. And then when we do see rapid tourism growth, like what happened in Napa, sometimes it can make business challenging because your time to get a permit might just go crazy. So all of these things we have to kind of learn from other regions. But really that comes back to this multi-level public, private, engaging stakeholders and kind of trying to mitigate some of these other issues that might be going on. So agritourism, it's really a great business model that everyone should definitely be considered. And I mention this because in the polls every single time, people don't typically pick agritourism. But if you've got a farm or if you've got a cider business, and you should definitely consider agritourism as part of your business model. It's a way to supplement farm income, and there's this growing desire by the public who is so separated from farming as a from farming as a culture, really, that they want to engage in this rural experience and these outdoor recreational activities. So by combining ag and tourism, we're able to offer something very, very unique to potential customers and also diversify your farm, which is really important for your income base. So besides the challenges, um, there's also financial things that go along with it, and there are different limitations. But there was this study recently that said it's actually the state and local regulations that become the biggest challenge for agritourism operators. And due to the distinct characteristics, these attitudes, values, and whatnot between communities, it's really like a comprehensive plan that you kind of want to think about for your area. But what do you do as a business? Well, you get involved in your local community and make sure that you are part of that plan moving forward. So that way, hopefully there are implementation tools that are being put into place that also benefit your business. So you become a part of that vision for the future of your community as plans are being developed. And during that process, we also want to make sure that your concerns are being put forward when it comes to financial and regulatory benefits and also burdens, to make sure that that is done in an equitable manner, because every community is going to be different, right? That to have a balance, we need to have different characteristics and attitudes and values of that community all taken into account. And part of that is some of these legal things that hopefully Jesse will be able to chat with us about, because it's not only federal things, right? It's state, it's local concerns. So I'm going to turn it over to Jesse. And that way he can dive into this topic of legal considerations for us. So thank you, Jesse, for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And Lisa said before that she kind of got the impression that this is complicated. It is. I'll lead off with with a disclaimer that this presentation and the information is for educational purposes. It's not legal advice. You should not rely on this for legal advice, particularly with these West Virginia ABC laws. They are very convoluted, and it's going to depend on your particular situation, and they are very complex. A lot of the cider people that I'm talking to have said that they basically had to make themselves a lawyer because that's the only way they could get through this. And I can understand that because it is very complex. Under federal law and under West Virginia law, so this is one good thing in West Virginia, both federal law and West Virginia law consider hard cider as wine. It falls under the definition of wine. So breweries and distilleries are different. And that's something that's beyond what we're going to talk about today, but just remember that in general, beer is one thing, hard liquor is another thing, and wine is a third thing. So if you want to do 2 pieces of that or 3 pieces of that, you've got to go through 2 or 3 different licensing processes. One thing is, if you have a license to manufacture, sell, or distribute wine, you don't need an additional license for hard cider. But that's about the only break you get. For most other things, you're going to have to get a separate license, and you'll see how kind of crazy it is. And that one complaint that I've heard, definitely the legitimate complaint, is that the licensing process is on paper and you have to go through it every year. There's nothing you can do online, and when you renew your license, you can't just check a box and say everything's the same this year. Now, each separate license requires a fee, but for the most part, I haven't heard a lot of complaints about the amount of the fees. It's more the process and how unwieldy it is. So let's go through at least some. I mean, we don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Normally, I would give a quiz at the end, but even I'm not that cruel, so I'm not going to do that today. But the first possible license you can get is a supplier, and that's a manufacturer producer, processor, winery, farm winery, a national distributor, or other supplier who sells to West Virginia distributors. You cannot, if you are a supplier, and this is the other thing about the West Virginia law, it has lots of these. If you are a supplier, you can't be a retailer unless you are a winery or a farm winery. Suppliers also cannot be private wine beds and breakfasts, private wine restaurants, or private wine spas. What Dean wanted me to do today, and it's just impossible, is for me to say, if you want to do X, then here's the license that you need to get. As you're going to see here today, it's really complicated. And I'm trying to figure out what the best way to lay this out on paper would be, whether a table or whatever. So if some of you out there are really creative, give me some ideas. The other thing is that most of the hard cider businesses that I've talked to in West Virginia have 6 or 7 different licenses, which is yet another heartburn issue that we have. If you want to be a distributor, you have to have your principal place of business in West Virginia. You have to have a warehouse for hard cider for distribution that's located in West Virginia. You make purchases from a supplier and you sell to a retailer, grocery store, private wine beds and breakfasts, private wine restaurants, private wine spas, specialty shops, all of these different businesses. All of these different things have definitions that will be in the legal or in the publication that Dee and I are putting together. And even in that publication, we're not able to go into a lot of depth because it's just so long and complex. Distributors also cannot be a retailer, and you cannot be a private wine bed and breakfast, private wine restaurant, or private wine spa. So basically, you have to decide, what do I want to do? And then you have to look at this maze called the West Virginia Code and see, can you do A, B, and C? Or are you going to have to pick and choose because of these antiquated laws that we have in West Virginia, many of which originate in the Prohibition era? Next is the retailer. Retailer is someone who sells wine at retail to the public at a place of business for off-premises consumption. Retailers cannot be distributors. Retailers cannot be a supplier unless you are a winery or a farm winery. It cannot be a private wine bed and breakfast, private wine restaurant, or private wine spa. And I'm wondering, and if anybody out there knows, I'm wondering if there are any private wine spas in West Virginia. That seems like a pretty specialized business under the code. You can't be a private club if you're a retailer or a Class A retail dealer selling non-intoxicating beer. Each of those have some pretty narrow exceptions. Okay, do you want to be a winery? What does that mean? That's where wine is manufactured or prepared. You can offer hard cider manufactured by the winery for off-premises consumption. So that's another distinction that's really important in West Virginia. You have to look and see, okay, can you sell wine to people to consume it on premises, or do they have to consume it off premises? And that's the reason that a lot of hard cider businesses have so many different licenses. And also a lot of these different, if you have a retail business and a winery business, they have to be segregated or in different buildings, which also makes it difficult. So a winery is for off-premises consumption, and your containers, kegs, bottles, or cans have to be approved and registered. You can also sell hard cider in sealed growlers for personal consumption and not for resale. There is a limited exception for on-premises consumption, no more than 6 free samples of up to 2 ounces per person per day. You also have to provide complimentary food for that, and a winery may be licensed as a retailer as well. Farm winery is similar to a winery, but with a couple of distinctions. First, you manufacture 50,000 gallons of wine per year or less. And here's where what Lisa talked about, the opportunity for apple producers in the state of West Virginia, or honey producers, or pear producers, or any of the inputs here. If you want to be a farm winery, number one is that 25% of the raw products must be produced by the owner on premises. In addition, no more than 25% of the raw products can originate out of state. So that means that they have to get 75% of their product in West Virginia. At least 25% of that has to be produced by the owner, but that other 50%, they can go outside of their premises to get it. Another crazy restriction, I think, I shouldn't editorialize as much, I guess, but after spending a lot of time with these regulations, I'm getting a little stir crazy. But you can only have one off-farm location. So if I'm a farm winery, I can have my parcel where the farm winery is on and one other place if it's approved. And the reason I don't think that makes sense is that a large percentage of farmland is leased, and many farmers have 10, 12, 15 different leases. I know a farmer in Virginia that has over 1,000 different leases. And so farmers are known to take their tractors all over the place. So to recognize that, I think a farm winery shouldn't be able to have more than one off-premises location. A farm winery can also be licensed as a retailer. You, again, similar to the winery, you can offer hard cider for off-premises consumption, but only in approved containers, growlers for personal consumption, and not for resale, and you can offer free samples. And Lisa says, would it be considered produced by the owner if the land is leased to another person to produce the raw product? That's a good question. From the definitions that I have seen, I think it would. I didn't see anything in the code that would prohibit that. So I guess I thought, as Lisa knows, and some of the others of you may know, the lawyer's favorite answer to any question is it depends. And I didn't think I'd be able to say it depends a lot today. I thought I would mostly say, and I probably will mostly say, the lawyer's second favorite answer to any question, which is I don't know. And I think this is one of those I don't know answers because the code just doesn't really address it. So that's somewhere where the code is not clear on that. So are you confused yet? Let's get more confused. So we have a private wine bed and breakfast. And I wonder if there are any of these in West Virginia as well. The sole purpose of a private wine bed and breakfast is to provide lodging, basically, and some food to the customers during their stay. Again, like a lot of these, that bed and breakfast has to either occupy the entire building or a segregated section of the building. Any sale of wine must accompany the serving of a meal or food. However, there is an exception. Up to 2 partially consumed bottles can be recorked or resealed in connection with that meal. So they can drink part of it while they're eating their meal. If they don't finish the bottle, you're allowed to recork or reseal it and send that home with them. A private wine bed and breakfast cannot be a supplier, distributor, or retailer. Private wine restaurant, and it says private. So this kind of goes back to the old rules in West Virginia about private clubs, which I think is really a Prohibition era law, but you can serve wine with meals, but not to the general public, but only to members and their guests. Again, must occupy the entire building or a segregated portion. You have to have at least 2 restrooms. You can get a waiver to reduce that to 1 restroom. And again, up to 2 partially consumed bottles of wine can be recorked, resealed, and sent home with the customer for off-premises consumption. You cannot be a supplier, distributor, or retailer if you are a private wine restaurant. Private wine bed and breakfast. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way there. Sorry about that. Festivals. If you want to serve wine or sell wine or sample wine at a heritage fair or festival, you can do that. You have to get a license for that, and the wine must be from a farm winery. If you want to have wine tastings, you have to get another license. And a wine specialty shop or a winery or a farm winery that has a wine specialty shop can get a license to do this. Wine tasting, you have to have a wine tasting club. It can't be for the general public. Again, for tasting and comparing wines, you can have your wine tasting not more than once a week. And you can't have a wine tasting on a distributor's premises. Now here, after all that kind of complicated and very cumbersome process. There is one area where West Virginia allows a little streamlining, and that means, or that involves a multi-capacity license. And that means you can get one license that allows you to be a retailer, supplier, wine specialty shop, and direct shipper without obtaining individual licenses for each. So you can combine those different types of licenses into one, but that is only available for a winery and a farm winery. And this just kind of summarizes some of those. If you're this, you can't be that. And I don't know which way to say it is more helpful, if any of them are helpful. But you can't be a distributor and a retailer. None of these businesses can be. Only a winery or farm winery can be a supplier and a retailer. And then the next rule is kind of complicated. It actually reminds me, the LSATs, if you want to go to law school, have a logic section. And this would be perfect for the logic section, because it basically, you can pick, or you can't pick from these menus. If you are a supplier or a distributor or a retailer, you can't also be a private wine bed and breakfast, a private wine restaurant, or a private wine spa. And again, I'm trying to wrap my head around what's the best way to display that, to show that in a way that it will be understandable. And I'm thinking maybe a table, but if anybody has ideas, I would appreciate it. A wine retailer cannot be a private club or a Class A retail dealer in non-intoxicating beers, and both of those have some exceptions. Something that I learned talking with Josh, and so I did a little research on this. There's something called an alternating proprietorship. And that's basically a situation where two or more businesses share the physical premises of a brewery or winery. And everything I have read out there says that this can be a really good thing, particularly in a state like West Virginia, where we want to grow this industry. And I know, talking to some operators, they were very frustrated because they actually wanted to build a facility where two different operators would share that facility, and they could not do that because of this rule. It allows, if I'm a startup, I'm just beginning, I can't afford to build a whole production facility for just myself. I can partner with somebody who's an established business and use their facilities when they're not using them. Or two different operators can share facilities, like the situation I talked about. And Lisa mentioned this. You look at hard cider producers or hard cider businesses in West Virginia, and you might think, well, they're competitors. So why would they want to partner, or why would they want to share and help each other? In actuality, though, and all the producers I've talked to, they are competitors, and they want to be the best. They want to be the best hard cider, or the best bourbon, or whatever it is. But basically, the more people we can draw into West Virginia for hard cider, everybody benefits because the pie is bigger, everybody gets more business, and um, it kind of grows it. I'd say a snowball rolling down the hill. It gets bigger and bigger as more and more people come. So people do want to cooperate. They do want to partner. But in West Virginia, they passed a statute where alternating proprietorship is very narrow. It appears as if somebody talked to one of the state legislators, and they passed a law for one particular situation, and that's a farm winery and a farm entity. That's it. So that's an area we need to work on as well, I think, is alternating proprietorship. So these are just a few of the recommendations that I've come up with so far. And I want to thank Brooke and Josh and others who I've talked to for helping me kind of start to see what's going on in the hard cider industry. I'm still learning, and the learning curve is steep because this is complicated stuff. But the licensing needs to be streamlined. I think we need to broaden the definition of alternating proprietorships, make it the same as the federal level so that these businesses can partner, work together. It can be very synergistic for them to do that and help grow the industry in West Virginia. Allow farm wineries to have more than 2 locations, given the way farmland is fractured. And we have a lot of leased farmland. You should be able to recognize reality and do that. All of these rules about if you're A, you can't be B, and if you're C, you can't be D. I'm not sure where that comes from. Maybe that is from the Prohibition era. But let's open that up and allow vertical integration and horizontal integration. I kind of alluded to this, but if you are a distillery and a brewery, you have to have segregated facilities, which, I'm not sure why that has to be. And allow direct shipping to people within the state and outside the state. Basically, I think the rules and regulations in West Virginia need a very thorough review and go through them and say, why are we doing this? And why don't we change this to make it easier for the small business, make it easier for people in West Virginia to produce hard cider. And so I'll stop there and see if we have any questions. I know we are at our 1 hour, but if people want to stay and chat some more and ask questions, vent, you're allowed to vent. We'll make notes and see if I might not be able to answer your question or respond to your venting adequately here today, but I'll do some research and we'll go back and try to answer your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jesse, for giving the overview for the couple people that are here that I think have taken these steps. Hopefully, I mean, I'm sure they would be able to shed a little bit of additional light about their experiences. I know I see Gail is still here. I would love to get her take on some of this, just because I know at our last session she mentioned that there's a lot of permits and licenses that you have to go through. Gail, are you still there? She might be muted at the moment. I'm not sure if is anyone else here let's see, Gladriel and Jason. Oh, you're a cidery in planning. So have you started to look at some of these issues as well? Or have you taken steps on any of the licensing that Jesse's talked about today?
I have read through a lot of that information, both on the TTB site and on the West Virginia site. I think I've looked more at the all-inclusive licenses there. I haven't made any of the steps, or we haven't made any of the steps going in that direction yet.
Gail is back with us. Gail, we were talking about you. We wanted to see if you had any experiences to share.
Hi, Jesse, and hi, Lisa. And was that Jason on there? Jason Hunt?
Yes, it was.
Was he commenting? Okay. Well, hi, everyone who's there. I keep going. My wife, I'm at a vacation house in South Carolina, and everything's fading. This was very illuminating. And Jesse, thanks for really breaking that down. I think I have a lot of notes here. I wanted my husband, Paul, to be able to attend and hear. This is exactly what we've been looking for to take our next steps, and with West Virginia for getting our farm winery license, and the bundle, hopefully, for also doing the tasting room part of it. I guess you call that retail or specialty shop. But Paul was taking our sons to the airport. So at exactly the wrong time. But this is a very great beginning. And Jesse, you say you and Dee are putting a book together. I think that would be very helpful for people like me, for people like us. And I'm hoping there will be others. And I also enjoyed your presentation, Lisa, on culinary tourism and experiential expectations of these people. That's very helpful. And we have a lovely farm with good views. So at the end of the Greenbrier Valley on the way up 219 toward Pocahontas County. So we can make good use of that. I'm sure we'll have questions for Jesse and for you. So I'll write down some emails.
Oh, perfect. Yes. So definitely feel free to reach out to us after this session. This is being recorded, and that way, if you would like to watch it later, you definitely can. Our emails are in a variety of places. They're in the email that I've sent out, and then in these recordings. And of course, if you're just Googling us on the WVU website, you can find us there as well. And then I know Jesse was looking for some feedback on if there's a best, if tables work for folks as the best way to navigate some of this information, if that makes more sense. I was trying to think of what kind of diagram would make sense for this, and
Exactly.
I don't know. I think a table might be best because the diagram just went whoosh in my brain.
I know, and the diagrams will end up, there'll be a Venn diagram, and they'll be going off in all those directions. And I think the tables would be much more clarifying for this information.
Well, if anyone has stories they want to share or questions that they would like to ask of Jesse, or I guess myself, but mainly Jesse, then you can definitely do that now, or let us know about your experiences. So one of the things that Jesse and Dee is working on for that manual, and then also giving some of the recommendations. What we're hoping is that the cider advisory board and eventually some kind of Beverage Industry Association, whatever that might look like here in West Virginia, that we can help make some recommendations on some of those policy changes that an industry group would exactly, that an industry group would be able to kind of put into motion to hopefully help the entire industry, and all of these businesses that are interested in being connected, because it is complicated. And at one point, I was sitting here during the presentation and with Jesse and thinking, oh, I wish they would just scrap it all and start anew because this is crazy.
That's
and
actually my idea too, just scrap it all and start over. But I did start on a diagram that I put up for y'all to look at.
that's how I felt during that presentation. I'm like, oh my goodness, start here and go that way. Because I'm thinking if I want to be a bed and breakfast that has wine, but I also have a shop, my shop cannot be connected, or I can't offer wine in my shop. And if I want to add anything on, you have to have all these separate buildings. It seems like a lot. For one person to take into account for every single like individual business. And then do we have to set them up with separate, I mean, they're all going to end up with separate business accounts and names, and it's just a lot of paperwork. Oh goodness.
That is one thing that we're going through right now, that the location aspect, to have the cider production in one area, the apple brandy distillery part in another, and then the tasting room has to be totally walled off and separate from that. So we're even thinking like, what are we going to do to use the dairy barn parlor, the old milk room, which would be great, or put up a new building, and we haven't even made a penny yet. So it's a lot to think about to meet
Yeah,
these requirements.
Dee was telling me at Swill Dog, if you want to like buy something from the winery, you have to go outside, and then you can't go into the distillery with it. It has to be totally separate. It seems like we're still back in prohibition.
Okay.
Yeah, that is one thing that they ended up taking on, was they have their main facility, which is really focused on cider, but they ended up having to build on a separate piece and calling that the distillery, and that's where they have a separate tasting room. And just like Jesse said, whenever we were there back in November, and even this year, you have to go through a separate exit to buy anything from the distillery side. You cannot go back into the other portion of the building, even though they're connected, but they have separate walls and they are very clearly distinct. It seems like a lot. Tina put into the chat a new license that combines different components from the ABCA alcohol legislation that is effective as of September 22nd, 2021. Oh, so this is pretty new.
Hi, yeah, this is a new, it's called Private Manufacturer Club, Private Club Manufacturer, something like that. And yeah, Private Manufacturer Club, and it allows you to be a distillery, micro distillery, winery, farm, brewery, etc. Sell it, produce it. It also allows you to serve food, and guests can have full range of the, in air quotes, property that you designate as the location. So you can have a restaurant, a tasting room, the distillery, winery, whatever you're going to do, as well as have events like weddings, etc.
Yes, thanks for that. I'll add that to my diagram.
Sure. And I will share that it is so new that when I called down to Charleston, they weren't sure about all the details. And they have one individual person who's responsible. He's the expert in all of the licenses, and he was out of the office, and they asked if I would call back because he could give me all the details, but this is the document.
But I noticed it's a private club, so you can't have members of the general public. So we have somebody who travels to West Virginia from another state and they're engaged in agritourism or food and wine tourism. They can't come in.
I guess unless you buy a membership to the private club. It also says on here 100+ members, so it doesn't sound like you can even be small at that point. It says amounting to at least an acre, which is continuous, bounded, or fenced real property. Interesting. I wonder if this was specifically written for a certain group that got it passed.
Yeah,
I'm
there
curious what
are
the history is.
there let me see if he sent me another link. There are other new licenses that are part of this. And oh, here it is. I'll put this link in there as well. Because it's called, I'll put them all in here. It's the entire list, but they have a new one. And it essentially, it's not a club, but it allows anybody to come in. And I can't recall what it was called, but I will copy this link for everybody.
It sounds like someone who wanted to have weddings.
And the link I just put in is the entire list of all of the licenses out with their fees out to 2024.
I never realized how many different fees were collected. Oh my goodness. Well, we'll definitely have to include these in the links for people to go through. And that way there's a reference. So thank you so much for sharing this, Tina. I really appreciate that.
Sure.
That's amazing. Okay. Oh, well, I definitely want to, I am just realizing what time it is. So thank you all for joining. I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate you being here. If you want to hang around, you can. If not, it is officially after the lunch hour that we were trying to take up. So good luck. Thank you all for participating in the cider school this year. I will be trying to send out a survey, and that way you can give us feedback on what you liked and how to improve for the future and resources that you'd like to see down the road. So I would definitely appreciate your feedback on that. But if not, if nothing else, we'll go ahead and get wrapped up. And again, thank you.
Thank you again, Lisa. Bye.